Good afternoon. Thank you. Very good. Welcome to the second session of UN 2013 Grand Rapids. This inaugural session, or I should say symposium, is devoted to commemorating the founding of the United Nations. And in view of that, this roundtable discussion, the United Nations Retrospect and Prospect, has been organized and is led by these three gentlemen here. Professor Gordan Vurusic, political science professor at Grand Rapids Community College. Professor Keith St. Clair, political science professor, Grand Rapids Community College. And Professor Joel Westra, professor of political science at Calvin College. Please pay particular attention to what they have to say as they engage in dialogue concerning this, and after a short while, you'll be asked if you would like to offer a few questions to the panel concerning matters pertaining to the United Nations. Also, note that we do appreciate the United Nations Association Grand Rapids chapter for providing funding for this particular symposium. Incidentally, there are applications to join the United Nations Association in the back of the room. There are also fundraising articles devoted to providing funds for the Campaign for Female Education in Africa, an effort that has been launched by Gamma Theta Upsilon, the GRCC honors chapter of that particular honor society. Please stop at the back of the room and look at what's available concerning the United Nations Association and those fundraising items, T-shirts and also calendars. So, without further ado, would like to commence this session and open it up, asking these three gentlemen to discuss their views on the United Nations Retrospect and Prospect. First, Professor Vurusic will begin.
Actually, Professor Westra will begin. So.
He will? I thought you said you were going to.
No.
Sorry.
Thank you all for coming this afternoon. We tried to coordinate our comments so that they would progress somewhat logically at least. We'll see whether we succeeded or not. We also intend to leave quite a bit of time for questions, so we hope you have them. But as you probably know, faculty can speak for a long time, so we'll see if we can rein ourselves in and really have time for a good conversation with lots of questions from the audience. The title of the panel is the United Nations Retrospect and Prospect, and as it happens, I'm going to be focusing more on the retrospect, and then my two colleagues, I guess, will be focusing more on the prospect, and then we'll have a general conversation. You don't have to know much about the United Nations to know at least some of the primary organs. The General Assembly, the Security Council, most people can name at least those two. The other primary organs are the Economic and Social Council, the International Court of Justice, which causes a lot of confusion to people. They think it's the International Criminal Court or just forget about it. Another one of the primary organs. The Trusteeship Council, which is no longer active, something we can talk about if you so choose, and the UN Secretariat. When one looks at the United Nations today and one looks just at the preamble, the purposes of the United Nations and so forth, one gets perhaps a different impression than was present when the United Nations was put together. The United Nations is a product of the Second World War, and the victors of the Second World War came together and said, we need an international organization, the United Nations organization, and their primary goal really was peace and security. The Soviet proposal said we should call this the International Security Organization, and there was a lot of discussion about what to do about the vanquished states, how would we make sure they don't rise again and threaten us. And so the perspective was much more focused on security. We tend to think of the UN much more broadly today, and rightfully so, because it does provide a broad foundation for a lot of different international institutions that govern an array of affairs today. But the primary goal at the time was security, peace and security. In fact, if you read some of the accounts of the conversations among the big four, as they were called, the four major powers. China was the fifth one, but wasn't really much involved in discussions about creating the United Nations. There were talks about a much grander vision, but some of these were dismissed as innocuous. We'll put some references into the preamble about justice and peace and cooperation, and that'll be innocuous enough, and we'll build this primarily as a security organization. So keep that tension in mind, because it helps us to understand a lot of things about the UN. It helps us to understand both how the United Nations became the foundation for a lot of international institutions promoting cooperation in a wide array of issue areas, but also why so much of the authority within the United Nations is in the Security Council. You hear quite a bit about the Security Council in terms of dealing with security threats around the world, and any sort of conversation very quickly goes to the permanent members, who were the 5 victors of World War II, who have a veto over decisions in the Security Council. They also have a veto over many other decisions. This means then that anything important that runs through the UN, the Security Council can have some say on and has the most authority. The Security Council also is the only body that can make binding resolutions. General Assembly resolutions are generally non-binding unless they become customary law or treaty law. The Economic and Social Council really is an oversight body. So the authority really is in the Security Council. This also reflects really the attempt by those states to secure their positions within the international system. And understanding that, we can understand then why the UN can seem strangely anachronistic, right? Why is it that France should have a veto, Germany not, Japan not, Brazil not, India not? It all has to do with that moment, that purpose, and what those states were trying to do. So to maintain security, to be sure that the states they had fought so hard in World War II wouldn't rise up against them again, and to hold on to their positions within the system, to continue that authority. As I said, the United Nations has become the foundation of a much broader set of institutions, and we shouldn't lose sight of that either. It promotes economic and social cooperation, and many treaties, many regional organizations that have been built since World War II directly reference the UN. The UN provides a foundation or provides a framework. But these two tend to reflect the time at which they're created. So when we think about the process of reforming the United Nations, realize it's really part of a broader process of reforming a range of institutions, economic and security institutions, and that this process tends to proceed very incrementally, because states that are privileged within the previous system don't tend to want to give up that privilege, to give up that authority, tend to resist that. So as time marches on and events change, more states enter the system through decolonization, economic and security threats change, new norms emerge. The United Nations and the institutions built upon it, both within it and outside of it, tend to have trouble keeping up. And that's the tension that my 2 colleagues will explore in a bit more detail and talk about some specific examples of.
Thanks. That was a good introduction. I guess I would just expand on and point out that the UN Security Council, as mentioned by Joel, made up of 15 states, 5 of which are the permanent members of the Security Council, each entitled to a veto. Normally, for a binding resolution of the Security Council to pass, it would require 9 of the 15 to vote in favor. So it's an extraordinary majority that's needed. And obviously, that's complicated and made far more difficult by the fact that any one of the 5, United States, Britain, France, Russia, and China, can vote no, vetoing the measure. So in effect, killing it. So you could have a vote in the UN Security Council 14-1, but if one of them is the big 5, like the United States, the measure dies. It does not pass. And so this has been brought forward as problematic. Certainly it represents the privilege of the victors of the Second World War, as Joel mentioned. They did write it. The victors of the Second World War made the organization, they made the rules, and they gave themselves a privilege in that organization. And many other states around the world question the fairness of that, I think quite rightly. And there's been a lot of talk on whether or not the Security Council should be expanded, should the number of states that serve on the Security Council. Besides the big 5, you have the other 10 of the 15 rotating on for 2-year terms. And some states take turns. Some states more than others. For example, Germany, Japan, the losers of the Second World War, are frequently on, if not always on, the Security Council, and yet they have been agitating because of their economic importance, their importance in the world, that they too should have a veto. So there's been talk about maybe expanding the size of the Security Council, allowing more permanent members other than the Big Five on it. There's been talk of the BRIC countries like Brazil, and then also South Africa has been mentioned as an important African country. So there's that movement. The charter itself, it's unlikely that the Big Five are going to allow any threats to their veto. It certainly raises questions of whether or not the UN can be, whether almost you would have to start from scratch, I suppose, to really reduce the privilege that exists amongst the Big Five. Another important thing that the Security Council does is authorize peacekeeping forces besides the binding resolutions that they pass. The peacekeeping forces are just that. They are peacekeeping, not peacemaking. And a lot of people, I think, tend to forget that. Meaning a peace has to be previously established for UN peacekeepers to go in there. And by UN peacekeepers, I'm talking about those with the blue helmets, those who wear the UN insignia. These are volunteered by member states around the world, not by the Big Five, but by considered more neutral states. The United States does not contribute its forces for UN peacekeeping operations. Sometimes the U.S. military serves peacekeeping duty on its own volition or on behalf of a UN Security Council resolution. But it's important when you're listening, therefore, about peacekeepers around the world, whether we're talking about UN peacekeepers or whether we're talking about United States military peacekeepers who are doing this of their own volition or on behalf of the UN, because the rules of engagement are certainly different. UN peacekeepers really have to have a peace pre-established. They don't make a peace. They go in when a ceasefire has occurred, and they go in either to monitor a previously agreed ceasefire or to, and that doesn't require a lot of troops, by the way, just a referee to cry foul if one side violates it. Or the second role is to place themselves in between the opposing forces. That's a much more dangerous mission and requires a lot more UN peacekeeping forces, which are very expensive to maintain and keep in the field. Very dangerous in the sense that if one side starts fighting, presumably you have to go through the UN peacekeepers to get to your enemy. And the UN peacekeepers operate under the idea that their neutrality will be respected by both sides. And of course, that isn't always the case. Sometimes the UN peacekeepers are attacked, and generally they have the ability to defend themselves, but that's pretty much it. And generally they will withdraw rather than to continue in a prolonged conflict. When the United States or France or Britain deploys their own military for peacekeeping duty, they can become peacemakers if they want. They can take offensive action. That's something that the UN is hobbled by in its peacekeeping role. And I think a lot of people in their criticism of the UN, because you certainly have that in West Michigan, tend to forget that aspect of it. I mean, I think they sometimes assume that the UN can be more than what it is. And it really was meant to be a forum for states around the world to talk out their problems rather than fight them out on the battlefield, one which I would say is a noble goal. But, and as that, it is a forum. And really nothing more. So when you hear critics say that the United Nations is ineffective, they tend to blame the UN itself, the forum itself, rather than who they should be blaming, which is really the Big Five, the ones with the permanent membership of the Security Council and with the veto. Because if the UN's not doing anything, generally it's because one of them has vetoed any effort to do something. So in effect, I mean, it would be like a meeting, the UN is a forum, much like this table. And if we were having a meeting around this table and nothing was getting done, it really wouldn't make much sense to blame the table for the problem. Say, oh, this stupid table, we need a new table. That's not the problem. It's really the people around the table, in this case, the Big Five, who are the members who aren't allowing the UN Security Council to be effective. And so that has to be kept in mind. Often there's criticism of the General Secretary, Ban Ki-moon, or any other, for being an ineffectual leader. I mean, he is the person, as Joel mentioned, in charge of the Secretariat, the bureaucracy of the United Nations and all the programs that it administers. But the Secretary General's one task is, that he has significant is that he can convene an emergency session of the Security Council. Now, if the Secretary General is not a strong leader, often it's because the last thing the United States wants, or many of these other Big Five, is a strong leader of the UN. You know, the last one that you know, Boutros Boutros-Ghali, one of the predecessors of the Secretary General, I mean, he ticked off the United States, which is why he was not renewed for another 5-year term. You know, nobody becomes Secretary General of the UN unless the Big Five approve it, because they could veto anyone. And generally, they pick someone who they feel is can be easily influenced or reined in. And the last thing the United States would want to stand for is a Secretary General of the UN who stood up to the United States all the time. So in effect, we get what we asked for. We get in effect a timid or weak leader of the UN, and then we complain about it. You know, we say, oh, he's weak. He's not a strong leader. But again, the last thing the United States would want would be a strong leader of the UN. You know, and then there's those who criticize the fact that the United States has sacrificed some sovereignty in joining the UN, but any country of the UN is free to leave at any time. You know, I see when I take my Model UN team to Chicago, we frequently see these billboards, you know, get the United States out of the UN, which really makes no sense whatsoever when you think about it. I guess they're afraid that the UN is going to, well, I always hear they're going to take away our guns. They're going to come in their black helicopters. They're going to take away our guns. And you know, it's such nonsense. The last thing the United States would want to do is to leave an organization in which we have a privilege, a role to play. I mean, why would we ever want to walk away from an institution that anytime there's you know, a binding resolution on the table, we can veto it? Why would we want to walk away from the veto power that the United States has? So, I mean, I think there's a lot of criticism within the United States, surprisingly, for an organization that I think has done a fairly good job. I mean, certainly it hasn't prevented war, as maybe its founders had thought, but certainly we haven't had a third world war, which I think is noteworthy, and maybe the UN deserves some credit. And certainly, I think that there's fewer wars, given the fact that we have an institution that where states can talk out their problems rather than fight them out on the battlefield. And if we didn't have such an organization, I think we can find the need to create one. So I'm not about the United Nations folding up, and I'm certainly not in favor of the United States withdrawing its membership and becoming isolationist again and turning itself back on the rest of the world. Certainly, I think the United Nations, you know, it was founded by the 5 victors of the Second World War. So yes, there's some unfairness in it. And yes, would I like to see some of that unfairness redressed? I would like to see maybe no states having a veto in the Security Council. But, you know, the likelihood of that happening is really minute, if even possible. But so given that we have the organization that we do, I'm willing to support it and work with it. And really that's what the United Nations Association actually does. And that's why I know Mike DeVivo plugged it, but I would invite all of you to really pick up a brochure and join the United Nations Association, because what it does is educate and promote the United Nations, an organization that I think has been very laudable in its pursuit of a more peaceful world. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Gordan, who's going to talk about the responsibility to protect.
Yes, thank you. I wish everybody a very good afternoon. I think from the very beginning, the United Nations suffered from a number of tensions. One of the tensions is what should be the role of the United Nations in the world. As my colleague, Professor Clair said, well, one of the roles that the United Nations has is forum for communication. And liberal or neoliberal institutionalism, a theoretical school in international relations, thinks that having such forum for communication is very important in preventing conflicts. Right? Another reason why we would have a forum, international forum, where countries can communicate with each other is the fact that there are many opportunities in this different international fora to create connections of reciprocity, right? Classical political liberalism as well as neoliberal institutionalism in international politics thinks that creation of reciprocity, creation of interdependence among countries around the world is an opportunity, basically, is one of the main mechanisms of preventing future conflicts. However, the United Nations, there is another tension in the United Nations. What should the United Nations be? Should the United Nations be something called intergovernmental organization, which means basically a collection of sovereign countries, where sovereign countries try to resolve their differences, communicate with each other, and create opportunities for reciprocities? Or should the United Nations be something called intragovernmental organizations? Intergovernmental organizations are organizations closer to, for example, the European Union. European Union is an organization where members of the European Union gave up a large chunk of their country's sovereignty in order to participate and benefit from being members of the club of the European Union. So what should the United Nations be, right? If the United Nations is just an intergovernmental organization, which means a collection of countries, collection of sovereign countries, where countries basically communicate and make certain decisions about international security, then we are really opening the United Nations to criticism, right? Because consciously or subconsciously, most people perceive strength or power in international relations as power to solve problems, right? And major problems that international relations and international politics are concerned are the problems of military conflicts, right? So how can an intergovernmental organization, which means an organization which is a collection of sovereign countries, how can such particular organization solve international conflicts, right? How can forum for communication solve already existing conflicts, right? There's another part of the chapter of the Charter of the United Nations, which basically talks about sovereignty of particular countries, right? Sovereignty of the countries means that no other country is allowed to get involved in the internal affairs of any member of the United Nations, right? So if there is, for example, genocide within a country that is a member of the United Nations, or ethnic cleansing, or crimes against humanity, how can the United Nations solve anything if the United Nations is unable to violate the sovereignty of a country in which such crimes are being perpetrated? Yes, perhaps the United Nations can agree about some kind of political sanctions. Yes, the United Nations can perhaps agree about some kind of economic sanctions. But it's difficult to imagine United Nations as an intergovernmental organization. Once again, that's a collection of sovereign countries, which would be able to take this principle of national sovereignty into account, and at the same time, for example, use the military force in order to protect the population within a particular country, right? So there are several tensions. One tension is what should the United Nations, what should be the role of the United Nations, what the United Nations should be, and how should the United Nations be effective in the context of this international norm of sovereignty of each country. How could the United Nations International Organization, even as a collection of countries, basically impose something on other countries when each country is has its own independence and sovereignty? So after the genocide in Rwanda, which took place in 1994, a group of international scholars, political practitioners, started to think about changing that norm, changing the norm of sovereignty, right? Because the norm of sovereignty basically prevented the countries, members of the United Nations, to do something decisive if there is something bad, if there's some kind of war, massive war crimes happening in a particular country. Right? So when these people got together, they came up with a name called Responsibility to Protect, and today it's called R2P, right? In a shorter version, right? Responsibility to Protect was basically was chosen as an alternative to rights to intervene. Right? One of the things that was being considered to as a new norm that the United Nations should pursue was right to intervene. But right to intervene basically sounded too imposing, too heavy-handed. Right to intervene had this echo of neocolonialism in which basically large and powerful countries tried to use military force and impose certain international rules on countries that are developing, that are mostly poor, on the countries that used to be colonies. And so instead of a right to intervene, we have the responsibility to protect. And responsibility to protect has been formalized as international norms since 2005 by the Commission on State Sovereignty and Intervention. And responsibility to protect does not necessarily is not necessarily exclusive to military force, but responsibility to protect means if a particular government in a particular country is not capable of protecting its own population or part of its own population, certain groups in society, from genocide, from wars against humanity, from ethnic cleansing, right? From war crimes, right? If local government, if government in a particular country is not capable of protecting parts of its population from these crimes, then according to this new international norm, responsibility to protect, United Nations as a group, as an organization, has the responsibility, not even the right, but the responsibility to basically intervene in some way, right, in which international community can protect local population from its own government. This is a very audacious proposition. This is a very audacious proposition for basically changing an international norm. Again, regardless of the fact that it is called responsibility to protect rather than right to intervene, it still has echoes of neocolonialism, right? First of all, who decides, for example, what part of the population is in danger? Who decides whether this part of the population, for example, has the right to be protected, right? Maybe these people are terrorists. Maybe these people are trying to undermine the sovereignty of their own government, right? Maybe these people are have to be dealt with violently by their own governments, right? So who decides that basically local governments or national governments cross that line in which the international community has to come in, or at least has the responsibility to come in and protect, right? Secondly, how can you, one of the questions that had been raised in the context of responsibility to protect, how can you call it responsibility to protect when the intervention takes place after the genocide is already happening? And who are you protecting, really? Are you protecting those who are still alive? And is there a possibility to basically do something before crimes happen? And how do we know that crimes are going to happen? And how do we know that the government is not bluffing or intimidating? And how do we make sure that we basically create more good than harm? And so these are some of the questions that a responsibility to protect rises. Right now, responsibility to protect is not necessarily a part of international law. It's something that in international politics we call emerging international norm. Right? Norm is obviously a set of rules. Right? Well, my professors from political science would say that rules and norms are different. Right? Norms are just sets of behavior in which your environment punishes you if you break them, but rules have certain sanctions. Rules are already written, like if you don't do X, then Y is going to happen, right? Rules have formalized sanctions, while norms do not also have sanctions, when sanctions for breaking the norms are informal, right? So right now, responsibility to protect is a norm, it's not a rule, because obviously we haven't resolved these questions, right? As to application of responsibility to protect, first time that responsibility to protect was to be applied was in 2006 in the country of Myanmar, Burma. Right? I don't know how many of you remember, but in 2006 Myanmar has a big cyclone that basically damaged a lot of homes and killed and injured a lot of people. So the totalitarian government at the time didn't allow international community to bring in humanitarian aid. So Western countries in the Security Council wanted to impose responsibility to protect Burma, basically saying that the Burmese government is not protecting its own people from the devastating consequences of the cyclone. And therefore, the country of Burma, the government of Burma, should be forced to accept the international aid. In the same year, in 2006, there was a conflict in former Soviet Union, right, against around South Asia, right. Some people in the international community were saying that the United Nations should apply the responsibility to protect doctrine to basically. Russia actually argued that international community should apply responsibility to protect doctrine in order to protect the Russian population in Southeast Asia, and that intervention against Georgia that Russia basically created was part of the responsibility to protect. Right? But first time formally, as a part of United Nations resolution, responsibility to protect was basically written when the United States and other Western powers intervened in Libya. Right? Just a couple of years ago with President Obama. That was the responsibility to protect was the first time, this was the first time in history that responsibility of protect was invoked in United Nations Security Council resolution. Military intervention was authorized by the United Nations Security Council under the Chapter 7 of the Charter of the United Nations as part of responsibility to protect the population of Benghazi, which is a Libyan city that Muammar Gaddafi and his sons threatened. They said that they're going to exterminate the population in Benghazi, and therefore the United Nations Security Council passed a resolution that authorized military action. And in this particular resolution, responsibility to protect was invoked as one of the principal reasons for military intervention. So these are some of the issues that are part of responsibility to protect. And responsibility to protect is definitely something that is going to become even more important in the future, right? What do we do about Syria, for example, right? Does the international community have the responsibility to protect the population in Syria, right? Right now, it seems that the only responsibility to protect in Syria is the responsibility to protect from chemical weapons, right? But many more people are being killed right now in Syria by conventional weapons. So what do we do about that? So why is it that the United States managed to use responsibility to protect in Libya and is not seemingly willing to push for the United Nations resolution to use responsibility to protect in Syria as far as the murders by conventional weapons are going, right? Which again puts the responsibility to protect in the context of the interest of major powers and in the context of neocolonialism, some issues that will be very difficult to resolve in the future.
Okay, I guess we'll open it up to questions. Mike, do you have a microphone for the audience?
Please consider your questions. And I'd like to ask you gentlemen, just up here. Microphone. Tell me, on a level of 1 to 10, 10 being vital, 1 being not really important at all, the United Nations today in facilitating peace throughout the world, where would you place it on that scale? Professor Westra?
Well, I would say 10 easily, and it's not because I think that the United Nations is particularly effective. It's not because I think the United Nations is particularly well designed for today's world. In part, it is because this is the foundational organization in which all conversations began. This is the forum in which states meet. This is the institutional framework in which lots of regional security arrangements are anchored, lots of treaties reference, and barring a major catastrophe, another world war, I'm not sure you'd get a full replacement. And as I've already intimated, it's extremely hard to make major changes. So it's necessary to have this sort of institution. This institution is enmeshed with countless other institutions. And does it need to be reformed? Yes, the process will be incremental, but consider an alternative. And the alternative is not some idealized institution that suddenly states agree upon. The alternative really would be getting rid of the United Nations and not having this forum, not having this institutional framework that enmeshes lots of other institutions. And so 10 in that sense. I don't know if that's a very resounding 10, but it's a 10 nonetheless by the scale I've used.
Thank you very much. Do you have anything to add, Professor St. Clair?
Well, I would rank it quite high, too. I mean, I guess if you think about your question, it's, if I remember it, what role, how much credit do I give the United Nations for peace in the world? I would be up there with a 9, maybe just short of a 10. I think that, you know, it's not a perfect institution. Certainly, it hasn't prevented all war, but, you know, the world has a lot of peace in it. And I think the United Nations deserves a lot of credit for those areas of the world that are at peace, because, as Joel said, you know, without it, there really isn't another game in town at the moment. And I guess I went with a 9 rather than a 10 because I guess, you know, I would also, you know, the nonviolent direct action, the role it has taken in the world, people at the grassroots, I think, play a role for peace, and I kind of want to reserve some credit for them, but I'm with Joel in thinking that the United Nations deserves a lot of credit for the world as peaceful as it is.
Thank you. Professor Vurusic?
Yeah, I mean, the United Nations is extremely important. If you, one of the things that the United Nations does, they publish every year something called Human Security Report. One of the aspects of Human Security Report is the number of conflicts that are taking place in the world today. And I regularly read that particular report, and you can see in the report that there is currently no wars between two countries going on anywhere in the world. That may change fairly quickly, but right now it is true. The dominant form of the conflict today is civil conflict, right? Conflict within countries, right? Rather than conflict between countries, right? And the United Nations is struggling about how to resolve this conflict, and responsibility to protect is one of its parts. Another thing that the United Nations does, for example, is redefine what is security, right? The Human Security Report. Remember that in classical studies of international relations, we always talk about international security, and when we talk about international security, we talked about the balance of military power. But human security says, well, security is not only about balance of military power. Human security is about access to food, water, shelter, security of jobs. All of that is part of every individual security, and all of these personal securities are basically very closely connected to the likelihood of violence within societies and between societies. Plus, the United Nations has created a number of international courts, right? One of them is International Court for former Yugoslavia. I'm from former Yugoslavia, and it is it is clear that the courts played a very important role in terms of sending the signals to others who basically were thinking or are still thinking of committing war crimes and war atrocities. That this is something that doesn't pay off. Of course, none of this. I mean, International Criminal Court for former Criminal Tribune, because it's a temporary court, so it's Tribune for former Yugoslavia is not perfect. Of course, there are certain political prejudice against different countries from former Yugoslavia and so on and so forth, but it's still very important. Then there is an international criminal court that the United Nations also basically created that is instigating a lot of fear among for example, among warlords in Uganda and other African countries that who are genuinely afraid of that. So the United Nations is perhaps weakest when it has to use military force, which was shown in numerous examples from Lebanon when during Reagan administration American troops were used in Beirut, but they could have their weapons, but according to the United Nations mandate, they couldn't have ammunitions. right? So they got killed by Hezbollah. And then in Rwanda is one of the most painful examples of 1990s civil wars in 1990s, where the United Nations came with very small number of troops, just in order to save the Westerners who lived in Rwanda rather than to help out to solve the civil war. But the United Nations is important for other aspects, for the judicial aspects, for redefining international security, for basically pointing out that international security is something in addition to balance of military force, as a form of communication, as a form of resolving differences, as a form of that creates a possibility for exchanging favors among the countries, among different groups who are represented in the United Nations. So it's extremely important, regardless of how ineffective sometimes it may look. But I think the world is better and more peaceful for it, definitely.
Thank you, thank you.
If I could just put this in context for a moment quickly. You get these high scores across the panel, and if you haven't listened carefully to what we've said, it could leave the impression, all right, here we have some academics who have this glorified notion of world government, and the UN makes everything better. But we've said something quite the opposite, actually, is this is a weak, rather ineffectual organization in many instances, in which state sovereignty is preserved. What we've said is not, it's amazing and it's the closest thing we have to global government, hooray. We've really said the alternative is far worse and there's far more going on than you might see. Indeed, if we really had a very visionary notion of bringing the world together, of creating some sort of very clear world government, we would have given it actually quite low scores. So I think the high scores mean the opposite of what might first appear if you haven't listened to the context that they're in.
Very profound, and thank you. I'd like to open the floor for questions now. Does anyone have any questions for the panel? Is that right here?
Yeah, I know that you've all stated a lot of the militaristic qualities of the UN, but with R2P, does the UN take any sort of stance on such things as FGM or rape laws in other countries, seeing how that kind of, I think, would apply to the protection of those that aren't sorry, I can't really think of the word right now, but in kind of third world countries, and how do you feel the UN should treat traditional ritualistic aspects of some things that might harm people in smaller nations?
I think that's one of the difficulties that I pointed out, right? How to differentiate between ritualistic and what is legitimate concern about genocide, right? How should it treat it? I don't have an answer to that. I think it should be it should be decided on a case-by-case basis, and it's very difficult to decide who is going to decide. And so I don't have a good answer to that. I don't think that UN has a good answer to that. So I think it's a very good question, but unfortunately, it's still being unanswered.
I thought it was really interesting. You point out a lot of the wonderful things that the UN does indeed do, and that certainly, I don't know if we'd have many people arguing in the room that we should abolish the United Nations, and because it does more bad than good. So, in that being said, I'm wondering whether you could point to ways in which it could be restructured to be more effective. Were there a willingness, and as you say, there has to be that willingness for people to strengthen the UN. On one hand, you pointed to maybe getting rid of the veto power or expanding the Security Council and so forth, which might certainly be fairer. But I'm wondering, in some of the dilemmas that you brought up, whether it would have actually made any difference. So, for instance, with Rwanda, one could argue that it wasn't primarily a fear of violating sovereignty or neo-colonialism or U.S. objections that prevented international action and prevented the UN from withdrawing their forces there, but rather it was a consensus of the entire Security Council to withdraw those troops because there was just generally a lack of political will and a diffusion of responsibility, and that diffusion of responsibility could increase even more the larger the Security Council, hypothetically speaking. And even today, With Syria, one could argue, well, it's the veto power possibly of Russia and China, but there's no consensus among various members of the Arab League or countries in the region as to what to do. So again, wouldn't necessarily be primarily the identity of the particular veto powers or neocolonialism, but the fact that there's a lack of consensus even within the region, much less internationally, in terms of what to do and how to do it. So, I wonder if there are any other ways in which the UN could be strengthened other than restructuring the UN Security Council, given, I guess, the things I just said. And I don't know if, for instance, something like a rapid reaction force, if the UN does decide, as belatedly it did in Rwanda, to try to stop the genocide ineffectually, and as it ineffectually with Chapter 6 isn't doing as much as it could to protect people in Darfur or in Congo where 5 million people have died. Is there something that could be done structurally in terms of a rapid reaction force so that if they were to decide and when there is a consensus that they actually can do something, and so they don't have to beg around for volunteer troops and money and APCs from the US and so forth? Sorry, that was a long-winded question, but I'm wondering what other reforms you would look at, because I'm kind of skeptical that in Syria today or in Rwanda in 1994 that a restructuring of the UN Security Council or a lack of veto power would have made much difference.
Well, keep in mind the problems that you're addressing are primarily internal problems. I mean, so the United Nations is ill-equipped to really, I mean, because all the states are worried about violations of sovereignty. So basically, all the members of the United Nations exactly would not be in favor of giving the United Nations more power or sovereignty over internal matters. So. You're right. The reforms that I suggested probably would not have had much effect in Rwanda, where you had the Hutus exterminating the Tutsis, and you're right about there being a consensus of non-interference in the United Nations, probably precisely because it was an internal matter and the precedent that sets. Not to mention the costs. For those states that would step forward to actually participate in intervention. So Syria, the same thing. I mean, you've got a civil war going on. Until it's a state versus state conflict, it's not a good test for the United Nations.
We do have the UN genocide against the UN Convention Against Genocide, right? Which supposedly is part of the UN norm. That actually even preceding the duty protect would authorize.
But it's that's to punish after the fact.
Yeah, go ahead.
It may be that the needed reforms, the only expected needed reforms already happened, in the sense that R2P did come out of General Assembly meeting in 2005. Peacekeeping itself is a reform. Even the way the Security Council authorizes military force is a reform. It's a reading between the lines, because the Security Council was supposed to use its own forces, and it never got its own forces, and so it authorizes states to act on its behalf. Maybe that's as much as we can expect now, and the best movement is maybe to continue some of these things, the General Assembly trying to help new norms emerge, the Secretary General perhaps working behind the scenes in certain places. Maybe it's not the dramatic, maybe it's a continuation of some of the less dramatic things.
I think that it's very difficult to create reforms within the United Nations. For example, rapid reaction force, right? If you create rapid reaction force, then United Nations may become a state, or who is going to decide how these rapid reactions are going to be used? Perhaps United Nations Security Council, but you will still have the situation in which one of the powers could veto it, right? So I'm not sure. I think that the role of the United Nations and its ability, willingness or unwillingness to intervene in foreign trouble zones when there is crimes against humanity, genocide, or ethnic cleansing taking place, depends on the willingness of international morality, right? Is that something that we really want to do or not? Because obviously this morality goes both ways, right? If you're thinking about intervening in terms of military intervention, obviously you're putting your troops in harm's way, right? And you are and you don't know what is going to happen, whether the certain war is going to escalate because of the foreign troops, whether it's going to get worse or better, or how is this going to take place. I think there was a very interesting speech by President Obama just recently in a United Nations General Assembly. Right? I think this speech is absolutely almost 180% different than his speech in the same forum in 2011. Right? In 2011, he was talking about the necessity of the United States to help the burgeoning democracies and human rights abroad. But this time he was saying, well, if you can help, okay, but the United States is not going to prevent it in practicing its own interest just based on human rights and morality. For example, I think he may have been implying we are still going to help the Egyptian military despite the fact that what they're doing to the groups who are opposing them. So I think that this fairly liberal, classical political liberal notion in which the human development is sort of linear, it goes from dictatorship, democracy, and never drops back, is something that was driving this responsibility to protect norm, right? But now we see that development of democracy is not linear, right? Then it goes up and down, and revolutions can create new dictatorships, right? I think that willingness and the vision of morality of international intervention is different. Perhaps going back to realpolitik, in which we do not care about what is really happening on the ground in terms of human rights and who is being killed, but we will intervene if it helps our own military, economic, and political interests. If it doesn't, who cares? Right? And I think that Obama sort of showed his disappointment in the lack of linearity of human development in politics, right? So I think the question is not really about reform within the United Nations. I think the question is about philosophy or prism through which we see how the human rights and independence of different groups in different society are developing.
Keeping in mind what you just said, am I doing this wrong? Keeping in mind, I can ask. There we go. Okay. Keeping in mind what everyone is agreeing about, the domestic issues of civil wars, could you comment on the 3 undeclared pieces, as in peace, between North and South Korea, Northern Cyprus and Southern Cyprus, and the issue of Kosovo, and how it fits your definitions?
Fits the definition of?
Well, the idea of interference, lack of interference, the role of the UN in these areas. Of the 3, only in one of the 3 the UN is present, that's in Cyprus, whereas the United States is keeping North and South Korea from escalating any discussion, and it's the European Union that in fact is making sure that Kosovo remains as integral as it has been so far. And so here there are 3 different settings that are looking at an area that has a very tenuous prospect. Any of these 3 could explode into very undesirable conditions. And the UN has chosen to stay away from 2 of them for some of the reasons you have described before. But I think my question is about what I call the non-declared peace, because all of them don't have a peace treaty. And they're not examples of civil wars. So then the responsibility, that moral issue that you used, should probably be commented on or addressed.
Well, I mean, the United Nations did authorize what became the Korean War. I mean, certainly the United States was the preeminent participant in defending South Korea, but the United States fought alongside many countries around the world and under the United Nations authority. So, I mean, in that sense, I think the United Nations was not a neutral party. The United Nations was very much on the side of the South against the North when the Russians walked out and did not veto the UN Security Council that authorized that action. So, I guess in that sense, the United Nations, was hardly in a position, I guess, to make a peace when it was in essence, took the side of one of the combatants.
Yeah, I was when UNPROFOR, United Nations Protection Force, was in my country, Croatia. I'm Croatian. I was a Croatian government liaison officer between the Croatian government and the United Nations force. And one of the biggest fears we had was what we called Cypriotisation of United Nations in Croatia, which means that we were afraid that the United Nations is going to stay there forever. And why? Because Cypriot Greeks and Cypriot Turks, at least according to the estimation of the United Nations, are not showing the deep willingness to create a permanent peace, right? So our task in Croatian government, that we try to communicate it in a repeated way, and in politics you always have to do things in a sustained, repeated way. You have to repeat it many, many times so that the other side thinks that you're really serious about it. So we basically, our task was to show to the United Nations that we, as Croatians, are capable of creating some kind of sustainable cohabitation and peace with Serbs, right, who were our enemies at the time, or perceived enemies at the time. And so one of the biggest issues in Croatia by which we wanted to stop the Cypriotisation of Croatia was the issue of Vukovar. Vukovar is a city in eastern Slavonia, and it was the city that was most heavily attacked by the Serbian forces by around 5,000 or 6,000 mortar runs a day for 4 months. And the biggest test for us was at the time whether what are we going to do with Vukovar? What is the Croatian government going to do with Vukovar? Because when UN came, United Nations basically established protection force in Vukovar, keeping Croatian and Serbian forces apart. But we wanted Vukovar back. So our thinking at the time was, what shall we do about it? Shall we do military action? Shall we basically do something in order to kick out the United Nations troops and just conquer the place with the military? Or shall we just take a very long, protracted negotiations with the United Nations and the other side in order to show the world, international community and the United Nations, that we are capable of peacefully cooperating and cohabitating with what were at the time our worst enemies, right? And we did. I mean, we did peacefully reintegrated Vukovar into Croatia, and that was one of the most important single step in showing the world, the United Nations, that we do not need responsibility to protect, right? I mean, the United Nations does not have to exercise responsibility to protect Serbian minority against, as government, international community was forcing us all the time to basically allow Serbian refugees and displaced people to return to their houses. For Croatian government, it was a very difficult time because many of these houses and apartments were already populated by Croatian refugees, right? So we had to basically kick out our own people, right, in order to basically show the international community that we are sort of responsible government that doesn't need to have international community intervene in order to protect minority in our country. Right? As far as Kosovo and the European Union, I think European Union is perhaps the most appropriate organization to protect peace there, right? Because sooner or later, Kosovo and Serbia and Bosnia are going to enter the European Union. Croatia, my country, entered the European Union in July of this year, which was a sort of big celebration, but now we are wondering why are we celebrating. But the entering into the European Union by all Eastern European countries is perceived as a holy grail, right? It's irrational holy grail because we are ceding part of our economic and political sovereignty. We were all in former Yugoslavia, we were part of former Yugoslavia, which was a sort of creation in which we, as independent countries, ceded part of our sovereignty in order to participate in Yugoslavia. So why would we just enter European Union? We cede part of our sovereignty to participate in a bigger club, right? But for us, it has always been a badge of approval, right? A stamp of approval. which basically was always a signal that we belong to the Western civilized world as opposed to those others. It was otherization, right, as opposed to others who are different than us in a negative way, right? But I think that this is something that Serbia, Bosnia, and Kosovo also want to achieve, and thus I think that European Union is probably the best organization to keep the peace there rather than the United Nations.
Gentlemen, thank you so much for this forum. I'd like a round of applause, please, for our speakers. And
Elisa didn't ask a question.
I'm going to ask those of you, in the interest of time, for those of you that have additional questions, to please come up to the speakers in just a few moments and ask those questions that I'm sure they'll provide you with sound feedback. There is another talk scheduled at 6:30. Keep in mind that that is occurring here, devoted to peacemaking in the Levant between the Israelis and Palestinians. Also, please keep in mind that there are applications to the United Nations Association in the back table, along with some T-shirts and calendars for fundraising for the Campaign for Female Education in Africa. Thank you so very much for coming, and once again, I look forward to seeing you later.